Well, in the coming days in the UK, there's going to be a lot of legal questioning over whether these three letters actually comply with the law. But the fact is, from the Brussels perspective, that question may be irrelevant because we saw when those three letters were received, Donald Tusk, the European Council president, tweeted out that he had received, quote, an extension request. So it's clear that the EU, whether or not the letter was signed, whether or not it was accompanied by these other documents saying don't pay attention to that first letter, they are interpreting this as an extension request. Now, ambassadors from the 27 other EU countries are meeting today at 9:30 to discuss next steps on this. I mean, I could summarize the reaction to what happened yesterday in Brussels as exasperation. People were really hoping that this deal would pass because in continental Europe, people are pretty tired of Brexit, and they were hoping that this deal would put it to rest. So now the question is still with London about how things proceed, because things are very unclear. Now, the EU, from everyone I've talked to here, the idea that an extension would be granted in order to renegotiate this deal, as it seems like the DUP, the Northern Irish Unionist partner of Boris Johnson, seems to want, that is a no-goer here. The idea that they would extend in order to tinker with the deal and change it, really from the EU's perspective, this is the last offer, not just because of firmness, but also because they don't see how else the circle can be squared here, how you can keep the EU's objectives of making sure there's no hard border in Ireland and satisfy what the DUP and others seem to want. So right now it's a kind of wait-and-see approach from the Brussels side, but certainly exasperation over the delay we saw yesterday.
So, of course, a huge number of questions still to answer. But do we have any idea of when the EU is likely to respond to Johnson?
Not anytime soon. So as I mentioned, they're meeting this morning, but don't expect any definitive statement from that meeting because they need to wait and see what happens this week in London. The really key thing is Boris Johnson plans to put this deal back to the Parliament maybe Monday, maybe Tuesday. It's not really clear, but the EU needs to see, does he have support for the deal? And if he doesn't, what are the next steps? That's really important because the EU needs to know if they were to grant an extension, how long does that extension need to be? If the political developments in London this week lead to a general election or a second referendum, that's going to require a longer extension, particularly for a second referendum. That would probably need a requirement of at least 6 months, and so it would probably go until the end of 2020. If it's just a technical extension to get this deal over the line, then that could just be 1 month. So they need to know it for the length. Also, the EU wants to keep the pressure on the British Parliament to pass this deal. In this sense, they are really on the same side as Boris Johnson here. They both want the deal to be done. And so I would say it's likely that the EU would wait until very late this month to come up with an answer to that extension request. They probably, in the coming days, are going to want to keep some ambiguity about whether or not they will grant this extension. And I would guess that the leader that would communicate that most clearly would be French President Emmanuel Macron. Now, do we really think that the EU27 would, at the end of this month, refuse an extension and let us go to no-deal Brexit? No. Everybody knows that they will grant this if it comes to that, if it comes to extending or going to no deal. So whatever the tough talk coming particularly out of Paris in the coming week, we can expect that they will do it. But they will wait as long as possible in order to try to put some pressure on the British Parliament in the coming week to grant that extension. We also see that the European Parliament is due to vote on whether to ratify this deal when they meet in Strasbourg on Thursday. That vote is still on the table. Apparently they will decide tomorrow whether to go ahead with that vote, but I'm hearing they may still have the vote to ratify the deal, again, in order to put pressure on the British Parliament to say, look, here on the EU side, we're happy with this deal, we're ready to go, please approve this. So that will be something interesting to watch tomorrow, whether whether the European Parliament decides to take that ratification off the table, because that would mean they can't ratify it until at the earliest November 14th, probably more likely at the very end of November. So that would obviously require an extension.
Dave Keating in Brussels, thank you very much indeed.